Welcome to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is the show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Sharice Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. Today, I have a returning guest, Brett Baba, founding partner, along with Andy Brown, associate at Graham Baba Architects in Seattle, Washington. Brett is an award-winning architect and, over the past 45 years, has worked across a broad range of project types, including residences, commercial, community-focused projects, and in a wide variety of climates and geographies. He is known for his attention to detail, the celebration of craft, and for his collaborative realization of buildings. Brett's work is widely recognized for its respect of place and community, which is highlighted in the firm's extensive portfolio of restaurants, public markets, and other hospitality projects. Andy is a personable and assiduous project architect/project manager, as well as a talented designer who has been working at Graham Baba Architects for over 12 years. Andy has extensive experience with both new construction and adaptive reuse projects, and is passionate about bringing new life to existing buildings and finding innovative ways to integrate contemporary with original. The project we will be talking about today is the Woodinville Whiskey Processing and Barrel Aging Facility in Quincy, Washington. Woodinville Whiskey's expansion is sited on a 10-acre sprawling grain field in Quincy, Washington. The design accommodates the growing demand for Woodinville's prized whiskey. The facility includes processing and bottling buildings, new corporate offices, and the barrel rickhouses, which pay homage to the region's agricultural heritage and the soul of the American South. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guests today are returning guest Brett Baba, founder and partner, and new guest Andy Brown, newly promoted associate principal from Graham Baba Architects in Seattle, Washington. So, being a whiskey girl myself, I am super excited to talk about this project today. We are going to be chatting about the Woodinville Whiskey Processing and Barrel Aging Facility in Quincy, Washington. Brett and Andy, welcome to Detailed. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you.
It's good. Great to have you guys back in the house, have Graham Baba back in the house to talk about another project. We'll just get right into it. I typically start with an icebreaker question. They go all over the map depending on my mood. For you today, for both of you, since we're talking about Woodinville Whiskey's new facility, I have to ask, with or without alcohol, I understand not everybody drinks, what is your favorite libation on a relaxing summer day and why?
Well, I'm a whiskey guy too. So I'm not just saying this because of the subject matter, but I honestly I prefer whiskey, and I really like a Manhattan. That's my drink of choice. So that's probably what I would say.
Have you tried a perfect Manhattan?
I have tried that. Yes.
That's one of my favorite. If I'm not just having it neat, that's one of my favorite cocktails.
Yeah.
Andy, how about you?
I'm also a whiskey guy. A little bit more of an old-fashioned guy. But on a relaxing summer day, I've the last couple of years really been enjoying spritzes, just to get into the outdoor summer. Pretend you're in Italy. In the piazza.
Yeah, I would just prefer to be in Italy.
That's
right.
I had the opportunity to go once on chaperoning a school trip for my kids, and I am dying, like literally dying to get back there. I'm working on it. I have to stop working long enough to get on an airplane and go.
Uh-huh.
So let's talk about Woodinville Whiskey. So we'll start with a little background on the project. I was doing some trolling online, which I love to do on projects. And I read and just loved that the kind of the tagline that I saw from the owners was 2 best friends in a dream. kind of story behind this distillery and its creation. So tell me about the client and their needs and goals for this project.
Well, yeah, it's a pretty cool story. It was started by two best friends. That's a true thing. And their names were Brett and Orlin. And this was not an industry that they knew anything about. Orlin had been a pilot. I can't remember what Brett did before, but they just decided that they wanted to do this. And they're very smart people, and they tend to, one of the reasons we love working with them is they tend to really trust their consultants and advisors, and they look for people that know what they're doing, and they reach out and they do their research. And they had a really good stroke of luck. So they needed to learn how to make whiskey because they didn't know how. And they approached the distiller at Maker's Mark, the guy who had, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but he had started Maker's Mark and brought that brand to kind of a premium level. Now, since then, the formula has changed. It's not quite at the level it was, but regardless, he came on and he was more than willing to come out here to Washington from Kentucky and show these two dudes how to make whiskey, and did so. And he stayed on with them for a while. So they had this master distiller come in and help them. And, that's just I don't know. I think that they made their own good luck there. And then they had to find all the ingredients. They had to find the place. They found a farmer out in Quincy where our project is to source their corn. And it was the Omlin family, and they had a number of acres of corn, and they used them as their source. And then ultimately, the Omlins kind of partnered in on the deal, and then they turned over some of the land where corn had been grown for this project. We got involved with the developers of the place where the whiskey distillery is in Woodinville. Hired us to do some master planning and to create this facility for these guys. They had been making whiskey in just an industrial, garage almost, and wanted something bigger, better, and more prominent, and something public facing. So we were, being involved in the development. We were the natural choice for them to design their building. And you've seen it. It's a it's a new building, but it kind of looks old, looks authentic, and they, immediately started making great whiskey, and kind of hit it out of the park. And as soon as it hit the market, it became very well known and popular, and received just great accolades for their whiskey. And ultimately, they have increased their operation exponentially, almost. So they had to make more and more whiskey. They got some capital because they were invested in by LVMH, and they realized that they needed to expand, particularly their warehousing and their aging. And so they got this land from the farmers and set out a plan to build 5 rickhouses, barrel storage rickhouses, and a bottling facility. But they didn't want to leave behind what made the whiskey great. And so because it had been made in Woodinville, and the water there is what the water is, and just they didn't want to change any of that. So it's still distilled in Woodinville. It's trucked in big tankers out to Quincy for the aging and bottling, and then goes from there. So they increased their production in Woodinville, by having that extra space to make more whiskey, and then this new facility. And the way the plan was we would build these rickhouses where they store and age the whiskey, 1 per year over a 5-year period. And so you can see how that kind of works. It allows them to have the first vintage aging, and then another one a year later, and a year later. Now we're at the point where we're building the 5th one, the last on that property, and they decided they're going to keep going. And so they've acquired more land from the farmers, and they want to build 6 more. So this just, you can see this is just growing, getting better as it goes. So it's just, a wonderful story of 2 guys who are really passionate about what they do, and, we're very successful.
That's brave.
I know.
To go start a business like that and have never made,
But,
made whiskey before. I applaud that. It's on my list, by the way, my shopping list.
Yeah.
I'm going to try it.
well, it has a very distinctive square bottle, and I think that was one of the stroke of brilliance too, because the identity of that whiskey, you see it on the shelf, you know immediately what it is.
I haven't tried it yet, but that's going to change very quickly. So I imagine you, based on what I've seen in the pictures, you can't miss this facility when you're driving by, because there are these ginormous letters on the side of the building that say Woodinville Whiskey. Before we get into specific project details, give me an overall broad description of this project. What were you tasked to design?
Yeah, so Brett said we started with the master planning phase. The site is 10 acres. It was to include a processing facility and then as many barrel storage buildings as we could fit on the site. There's also a very large acre plus irrigation pond on the site that is also used for fire suppression for the buildings. So a lot of this project was driven by the hazardous occupancy of the buildings, and also a lot of insurance requirements, because we're dealing with buildings that are housing 10,000 plus barrels of whiskey. I can't remember, at some point Brett and I did the calculations a long time ago and each building has tens of millions of dollars of aging whiskey in them. So there are big insurance concerns when you're dealing with a highly flammable liquid. And so just figuring out how to space everything apart appropriately and how to get fire suppression out in the middle of farmland in Eastern Washington, and how to organize all of these things on the site so that large trucks could move in and out of the site efficiently, barrels could move across the site efficiently. There's a lot of industrial process that we don't necessarily deal with, and a lot of work we do.
I had never, it hadn't even crossed my mind about fire, and that makes total sense, but that just didn't cross my mind. That is not something you want to catch fire with that much alcohol. That one is one I missed in all my trolling. So tell me about the decision. I'm starting to get a vibe of what the answer to this question is at least partially going to be. Tell me about the decision to use pre-manufactured buildings as opposed to building them from the ground up.
Well, for large kind of industrial processes like this, the pre-manufactured buildings are pretty ubiquitous. I mean, they're an obvious choice. They're very economical. They accomplish large spans. They're erected very quickly, particularly when you have a repetitive long thing. And the number of barrels that's in these was, as Andy said, was sort of dictated by the fire code. And so we knew, we had a certain number of barrels that kind of dictated the length of the building. We knew how high we wanted to stack them and how deep, 12 deep and 6 high, and that gave us the dimensions. And fortunately, those companies are very, they're accommodating for that kind of thing. We wanted a nice pitch on the roof. So, it was a pretty obvious choice. Now, when it came to the processing building, that's a little bit more unique. It's got several different things going on. There's loading, there's, big tanks. And so we had to adapt the sort of very straightforward design of these buildings into something a little bit more unique, particularly, as Andy said, trying to get the trucks around the building to load and unload the barrels, unload and unload the liquids. And so, the company that we worked with on this project was accommodating, and allowed us to customize their design a little bit so that it would be more useful. But if you watch these being erected, they go up very, very quickly. Large amounts of space is covered very quickly, so that was a huge advantage. And Of course, there's the additional advantage of the fact that the companies do the engineering on the buildings. So we don't have to provide a third-party structural engineer to design the buildings. They do have to design the foundations, but not the actual building itself. So there's a real economy there as well.
Interesting. I'm going to go down a rabbit hole for a second. So this question is not on your list. How does that go with permitting? Any challenges with permitting when you've kind of got that's because that's a bit of a unique situation, and who's designing what and.
It really is, and we have to kind of consider that going into these projects because, it's when you submit your set of plans, you don't necessarily have the building, engineered yet. You have the site work and you have the foundation, but you don't have that there's a different engineer that's going to come along with their shop drawings and their calculations and submit that. So what we've found, since we've done a lot of these buildings in different jurisdictions, it varies a lot. And that's one of the challenges is whether or not the local jurisdiction is going to be okay with receiving the engineering for the building as a submittal, as opposed to being an upfront, thing. And Andy, I don't know if you want to elaborate.
Just to say that kind of the way the prefab manufacturers work that we've seen is once you commit and get the building and they start on the process, that starts a timeline, and that you move through design, shop drawings, and once that's all done, the building shows up a certain number of months later. And so that's why you can't they won't do that design work up front, so you can permit, which may take 6 or 10 months to get through, and then then kind of pause and come back later. It's kind of, you put a deposit in, they start the process, and the building shows up when it shows up. And, this one in particular was Butler Buildings. They're a massive company, with operations all over the world. And we're very small fish with these 5 buildings that seemed like large buildings to us. But for them, they're just, they crank these out all the time.
I can't even imagine. But there was lots of extra meetings. Let's talk about the site first, and we'll work our way from the outside in. Were there any unique things or challenges you had to consider with the site as you were designing and placing the buildings? And if so, what did you do?
Yeah. One thing, when you walk out on the site, 10 acres, it feels very flat. But when you start to look at the topography, and I think we all know this, like nothing is ever dead flat. But what we learned with the barrels is the way they move them around really does rely on the ground being very level, because these barrels are very heavy. If you think about the shape of a barrel, it's, the ends are smaller than the middle, and it's that's designed so that the barrels are easy to roll around. But if you have something that's not flat, then those barrels get away from you quickly, and they're very heavy and they're very expensive, as we've talked about. So dealing with making grade very flat across, not only the entire process building, but then getting over to the barrel storage facilities was one challenge on a site this large. Fire suppression was another big one that we've talked about, and started mitigated with the large pond, which had its own pump house specifically for this project to get water to the buildings if ever needed. Spacing between the buildings became important to deal with not having flame or spread from one building to the next. Those were a couple of big things. And then we also started to try to think about what these buildings are supposed to do, which is age whiskey, and how orientation on the site might aid that. And so I think you look at a site plan, there's a small shift. The buildings are not orthogonal to the site, I guess. They're shifted about 10 degrees to the west in order to take advantage of kind of the longer, hotter afternoon sun and heating up the buildings. And I think we can get into a little bit more later about the rick houses of why it's important to have that extra heat gain for the whiskey making process.
I have a feeling I'm going to go down a lot of rabbit holes. Any plans to have a tasting facility there, or is this strictly going to be production?
So when we started this project in 2018, Washington state liquor laws were at a point where you could not technically have a tasting room at this facility because they were not distilling whiskey there. They were just processing it. Woodinville Whiskey, along with several other big distillers in the state, have been actively working and lobbying the state liquor board to change that law. And so we did do some preliminary design for a tasting room out there that would be attached to the processing, the west side of the process facility. And we still hope that someday we'll get to do the design for that, and they'll do an addition once the liquor laws are changed.
Let me know if you need me to sign a petition. Happy to do that. So let's get into some detail on the interiors of these buildings. But first, for our listeners, because I didn't know what this was when I first read it, I felt kind of ashamed. Explain to me what a rickhouse is.
Sure. So really simply, it's a building to age whiskey barrels. There's a lot of historic precedents for these in Scotland and in Kentucky. We started looking into a lot of ones in Kentucky and even talked to some designers who are still actively building and designing these out in Kentucky. Out there, they're traditionally fairly tall buildings, as much as 9 levels of whiskey barrels, which equates to about 3 stories tall. They typically are built from wood framing and the racks themselves are built out of this wood framing that becomes the structure for the building. So essentially you just clad the racking systems, and there's kind of systems of ramps to move the barrels around. And the height on those is important because you need to create stack effects to move air. You want temperature differences in the whiskey, or in the environment the whiskey is aging in, is what helps drive the whiskey in and out of the oak barrels and gives it its flavor. And so the more you can drive the whiskey in and out of the barrels, the more flavor you impart faster. And so you don't have to age as long to get the same flavor. And so in Kentucky, when they have fairly even temperatures throughout a lot of the year, they would use height of these rickhouses to help create temperature gradients from low to high. And so they'd move the barrels throughout their aging process to different levels of the building to help with that temperature changes.
Well, I guess first, any idea where the term rickhouse came from? Is there some piece of this? I heard you say ricking. Is there something?
The ricking is that just kind of the framework or the racks that hold the barrels.
Okay, that makes sense. And so are those typically always wood?
In Kentucky, that seemed to be the case. For our project, they are metal racks that the barrels are stored on. I think in more modern whiskey, that tends to be the case. But historically in Kentucky, they've been doing it there for hundreds of years. So it was historically wood.
Yeah. Those metal racks are a little less flammable. Okay, so I understand the initial phase included a processing and bottling building, which also houses corporate offices. That caught my eye. And there are now the 4 completed rickhouses with the 5th one under construction. Let's start by talking about the processing and bottling building. Tell me about the spaces inside that building. What would I see?
Well, you'd see a pretty large open industrial space with a lot of whiskey in it. And there's an area where the tanks are these beautiful stainless steel tanks. They're really kind of like works of art, where they are receiving this liquid that's coming from Woodinville, and goes into these tanks, which is going to then be put into the barrels. And there's a lot of really cool mechanisms for doing these things. The barrels, traditionally in a rick house, what would happen is that they would roll on almost like these small railroad tracks to the rick house, which we really wanted to do that, but it just it wasn't going to work. They just don't do that anymore. So they go into a truck, and then the truck takes them over. It's just a pretty large open space with a lot of equipment in it. We kind of segregated off to one side the offices, and so there's a big firewall, obviously, and then just not a very big office space, but just adequate for what they need. There were a few cool things, and maybe we'll get into this in the reuse, but there were some cool things brought from the Wooden Build building over and put in place when people signed the steel, and so there's a stair and some railings and some other pieces that have some history in the making of the whiskey that came over to this building to give it a little bit of character. But yeah.
One of the things that just popped into my head as I was reading about this project was, okay, processing and bottling and their offices in the same building. And I'm thinking, okay, processing and bottling in any kind of, my youngest son works for Boston Beer. He's a senior product developer. So I actually have a little bit of exposure of seeing the behind the scenes works in different kinds of facilities. One is typically messier, noisier. The other one, you have people sitting at desks trying to get work done. Did you have to do anything special to put these two kind of opposite activities in the same building and have them work together?
Well, we did segregate the two uses pretty distinctly with a big wall. I think both for safety reasons, but also all the reasons you said, and that sound and that sort of thing. The part of the building that's the offices, we try to get a lot more daylight in there. So we have a glass wall on one end of the gable structure. We did kind of an interesting window that becomes a skylight up onto the roof, kind of a ribbon of glass that sort of wraps down. We did that to kind of announce the two different uses, announce the entry of the building. There's a level change when you go from the office to the processing. So, you're definitely moving to another world when you go back and forth between the two.
Tell me about the design of the rick houses. If I walked in there, you just described it a little bit, and I don't know, maybe we have described it enough, but what kinds of things do I see inside the rick houses? Is it just all these metal racks with barrels on them? I would assume you had to put some other things in there.
Oh yeah. No, that's where the magic happens. That's the place everybody wants to go. And you step in there, and then the most amazing thing that you will experience is the smell. And, you step into this alcohol, infused air, and it hits you. And as Andy said, the whole reason for doing this, and the reason why these buildings are in Central Washington, is because we have this wonderful diurnal temperature swing, and that's the best thing you can have. And so what we're doing is driving the vapors through the oak barrels in and out. And it's really, I was surprised to learn how much. By the way, that smell and that that mist almost in there, it's called angel share. And angel share is what's lost out of the barrel into the air. And, it's remarkable how much of the liquid actually disappears in the barrel over the 5 years because it's being, driven out into the air, which of course makes it highly flammable. And you would never want to light a lighter in one of those buildings. And all the electrical things have to be explosion proof, and, everything has to be vetted by the insurance company. But there's just this magic when you walk in the door on the end and you look down this 300 or 400 foot long aisleway that is, I don't know what to say. It's about 8 feet wide. It's fairly tight. And then you see just barrels on both sides, all the way to the roof. And as you walk along, you look down these racks and you just see this repetition. And you just kind of are aware you're in this amazing place and has so much history. And there's so much really interesting things about, how the barrels are put in, that the guys who put them in have they have special knowledge because they have to orient the barrel exactly right so that when it rolls to wherever it's going to roll, whether it's in, the first one or the second one or the third one, it has to land with the bung up. So that little cork that you see on the top of the barrel has to be up so they can test it. So they know where to start that rotation so it's going to end up in the right place. You can kind of walk back there, but it's quite tight. Everything's really dense in there. We got this really cool machine, this lift that can fit down the middle of this aisleway, and the aisleway is somewhat designed, to accommodate this machine. And it's this kind of almost like a forklift, but a little bit more vertical. And it's specially designed to take the barrels up where they need to be, rotate them so that they'll be in their proper orientation, and then they can be rolled down. So it's designed around that mechanism. It's designed around the process of getting them in and out, having, be as kind of efficient as possible with space. But we have to have a certain amount of space for, if somebody's in there in an emergency, they got to be able to get out. But you're just the proportions of it, the proportions of the height of this aisleway with all these barrels on each side, the smell, there's a certain darkness to it. There are windows into these buildings, and we can explain why later, but it's just very, very cool. And it's always fun to walk into those buildings.
I am learning so much about whiskey right now. I'll tell you that much.
Therese, I would encourage you to Google rickhouses, because if you look at the tradition, as Andy said, we did a lot of research into these buildings, and there's just a reason for everything and how they were done. You actually can find online, if you really look, some pictures of when they have actually exploded. And when they explode, it's devastating. And so there have been a couple of these where they've actually caught fire and blown up.
I don't think I would want to witness that.
No.
So one of the things, and you've already started to touch on this a little bit, is that these rick houses are uninsulated and unconditioned. I love what you mentioned about the electrical and being explosion proof. Like I never even thought about, and I worked in MEP, and I never even thought about MEP systems, but they're uninsulated and unconditioned. So explain to me in more detail what the reasoning is behind that.
Yeah. So, and I mean, this even starts with why this facility is in Quincy instead of in Woodinville, the namesake of the whiskey company. And that's in, the western half of Washington. You have pretty even temperatures throughout both the days and even throughout the year. We don't have huge temperature swings. Whereas in eastern Washington, you'll have temperatures throughout the year from 0 degrees to well over 100 degrees. And even the diurnal temperature shifts at times of the year will be 20 to 30 degrees or even more from night to day. And those temperature shifts are really what helps drive whiskey in and out of the pores in the oak barrels. And that's where you get the flavoring from. That's what makes bourbon is it's one, the corn percentage in the mash, but also that you have a charred oak barrel that you age it in. And it's that the whiskey, the liquid whiskey going in and out of the charred oak staves of the whiskey barrel that gives it most of its flavor. And so those temperature shifts are really important. And so, insulating the barrel of these buildings would be antithetical to what they're trying to do out there, right? It also plays into things like with the fire suppression. Again, you can't have a wet fire sprinkler system in a building that might be down and below freezing in times of the year. So these huge, you can't have a wet sprinkler system. And so we have these huge dry systems that, you have to get water from one end of the building to the other in under, 30 seconds. And so these high pressure pumps that do that to get the water moving around the system if it's ever needed. So it really did drive a lot of the design of these buildings.
that was a piece that really surprised me because whiskey is a little bit newer hobby for me. And I just assumed, like you want to keep wine in a cool, dry place typically. And when I saw that, I'm like, wow, I didn't, you want it to get hot and then cold, which is probably, I don't know how they age wine, but I don't know if they want to do that with wine. I know once I get the bottles, they're supposed to go in a cool, dry place. But that was a surprising fact to me because I saw uninsulated. How are they doing that with aging? I just assumed that you wanted to keep it dry and cool, but not have temperature fluctuations. So that was a surprise.
Well, you can imagine you have to, if you've got a jurisdiction that isn't familiar with that, trying to explain, well, with the energy code, we can't insulate the building, and yet the code says you got to. So we have to, you have to figure that out as well.
Good point. You want to get that permit, it would seem to me that as far as working with building officials, because they are different in every city or in every jurisdiction,
Right.
It can be night and day difference from one to the other, that for a project with unique requirements like this, when it comes to permitting and special design things that are not like a normal building, that contacting them way early
Okay.
before you need them to review things, asking for a meeting, hey, can we talk about some of these things, would probably be a really good way to be proactive and not having problems with them later if they're not familiar.
Absolutely. And I think it was interesting because we're dealing with Grant County was the permitting jurisdiction. It's a very agricultural county. And so they do deal with a lot of these large pre-manufactured buildings, because they just have a lot of uses in agricultural use. But I think I'm pretty certain we were the first whiskey storage facility in the county that they had dealt with. And so, yeah, a whole set of unique circumstances related to that. And we talked to them early, and they were good about kind of getting a lot of that stuff out front that was different from what they're typically doing. And kind of from there, it went pretty smoothly to get these permitted. So,
well, that's good that they came to the table and were willing to work it out. It's not always like that everywhere. It's some places it's my way or the highway. Describe for me some of the unique design elements on this project. We've touched on little things here or there. One of the things that was popping in my head that maybe you can throw in there is the roof.
Yeah.
It's like, how did you do the roof? But what are some of the things that are unique about this project that you got to take on?
Yeah, well, so what we find intriguing about working with these buildings and these manufacturers is how can we get some unique architectural character, out of something that is so formulaic? And we've learned that there's only so far you can push the system before you lose the economy of it. And they have a very standard set of details and standard way of doing this that is the economy of it. But if we want to try to tweak it a little bit to give it some character, and so that's what we've kind of been doing with these buildings over the years, and we've done it for other clients as well. What can we do? And so we kind of know how far to push it. So if you look at these buildings, you'll notice that really we put a lot of our effort into the ends of the buildings. They're very sort of regular along the sides, but when you get to the ends, we kind of peel back. We ask them not to provide the end walls. We would provide them with our general contractor as opposed to, their standard end walls. And so what we tried to do is expose the what's called the bent, the frame that's this moment resisting frame that's the kind of ubiquitous shape that you see in those buildings, and pull a wall back so that could be exposed. We changed up the materials a little bit on those ends. We used some wood, and then in the case of the offices, as I said, we put glass in there. So all of a sudden now the building is it's not just that standard look that you see. And earlier in my career, I was working with this other architect named John Kennedy, and we realized that there's always one detail that you fuss with and you think it's the most important thing, and it's like you tell the contractor that's the one detail I'm going to lay on the hand grenade for. This is the one really important thing. And I find that very often that thing is the roof edge, how the building meets the sky. And so we had this one idea that we really wanted to try to achieve on this, and that is where the standing seam skin of the building and the roof, the wall and the roof, come together, rather than having a big gutter there and kind of a chunky piece of trim. We wanted it to be kind of like seamless, so when those ribs came to the edge, they would just fold down. And I think you'll notice that if you look at the pictures, that it's pretty cool when you look at that edge of the building, that it just folds down. It took a lot to get that built, because that's not how the roofers and siders tend to do it. But, I think that you take that detail, some of the things we did with windows, and then what we did with the ends of the building, that's what gives it the character. The one other thing that everybody notices is those big white letters, those ginormous, you can see them miles away. So that more than anything, I think, has an impact. But I think that, as Andy mentioned earlier, we tilted the buildings a little bit. And part of that, too, in addition to just temperature reasons, we kind of wanted it to have a certain look as you were driving down the highway, that you would see, these 5 or 6 building ends, as an identifiable thing as you go along. And they're giant, big, huge numbers, each one 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so kind of tell us a little bit of the story of the making of the whiskey just while you're whizzing by on the road.
I have to admit, and normally I have my pictures open during the podcast, and I forgot to open them. But when I first was looking into the project and first glanced at the pictures, not in detail at that point, I didn't realize right out of the chute that they were manufactured buildings.
That's great.
And then when I started putting the script and the episode together, I was looking and I'm like, wow. That was not if I was driving by, that was not my initial impression, because I was driving by that picture in my head. Mm-hmm. Because they can be very just a box, and that was not the impression I got or felt when I looked at that project at all. Yeah. So you're succeeding in what you're trying to do.
Good.
So it seems to me, this was another thing that popped in my head. All kinds of good stuff pops in my head. It seems to me that designing specific required spaces within a predetermined size of a building, rather than, building the building that you want to fit the spaces that you need, could be challenging. Were there challenges for you inside either one of the rick houses or the processing facility to get what you needed inside to work with the size and shape of what got delivered to the site?
It wasn't really too challenging, because they're actually pretty flexible about, dimensions of the building. Now they have standards, like they can only span so far, but they can span pretty far. The sort of regularity of the structural bents, has to be within a certain kind of parameter. It's usually around 20, 25 feet. So you kind of have to work with that. But really, they were willing to make them, as long as we stayed within their system, they would, make them kind of whatever we needed. And as Andy said earlier, it's like, okay, we've got a site that's a certain size. We have to space them certain distance apart for fire reasons. We know exactly how big the barrels are. We know how many we want to go across. We have this machine that has to go down the middle, and then we have to have an exit aisleway. So we just kind of added all that up, and that's what told us how wide the building was. And then the length of the building, had to do with how many barrels we could actually put in there before we exceeded, what the insurance company would allow us. And then the height, same thing. We could go. It was really dictated by how high that lift would go to get the barrels in. And so, that's height, width, and length was kind of driven by, really the modularity of this ricking system. And as I said earlier, that on the processing building, we had to accommodate things like loading docks and tanks and so on. And, the Butler company was willing to do the things we needed to do there. So, yeah, it worked out quite well.
Well, that's good to know. I don't think I realized, I mean, I knew that you could get different sizes, but I don't think I realized that you could probably go further than that with the company to get to where you need to go with these, pre-manufactured buildings. So that's really interesting.
I thought one interesting point is in the processing building, especially when they came back with the initial design, they asked us if, like Brett mentioned, these steel bents are the main primary structural member that are essentially wide flange frames, but they're all custom made and fabricated by the prefab building manufacturer. And they were all different. There's 20 of them along the length of the building at 20-foot intervals, and they were all a little bit different. And, they asked us like we can standardize these so they all look exactly the same, but that costs a little bit more because we're using a little more material. Like the worst case scenario is driving all of them. And Brett really pushed to have them be just what they needed to be, because that was an interesting part of the story. And so each structural member is kind of telling the story of what that section of the building is doing and what the constraints are and the different spans and the loads. And so that was a cool little thing that if you stood in the middle of the building and stared for a little while, you'd start to notice that every single line of structure is just a little bit different.
So I've been around a while in this industry, and I've done a lot of different project types. I have never done any kind of whiskey or winery or that type of facility. That's not the kind of project most architects get to do every day. Were there any challenges in designing this kind of facility or new things you had to learn to actually be able to design it? Because I don't know how whiskey is made. If I was, I'm not an architect, but if I was going to go design a building, I'd be like, oh, I don't know anything about the kind of spaces they need. This is not an office building or things that we see all the time.
Yeah, I think almost everything we've described so far in the last half hour was a new thing for us, that we had to really sit and think about and learn about each different thing. And, we had a process engineering team that kind of helped, and really knowledgeable owners with the kind of how all the equipment needed to lay out and the space it needed to make the whiskey process work for them. But then all of the fire suppression, all of the insurance stuff. We worked with FM Global, which is the biggest insurer in the world, and for the amount of time we spent with the permitting jurisdiction, we spent probably 3x time with FM Global's permitting requirements, because they have their own set of requirements that go above and beyond local jurisdictions, in order for the building to be insured by them after it's completed. And so we spent lots of hours working through with their teams on, okay, the building code says this, but we really need this in our sprinkler system. And, I think you'd find places where we'd start to get contradicting information from them where they'd want these two different things. And we're just like, we can't do both of these. They both can't happen at the same time. And then you kind of have to, they go back and they have internal meetings and decide. So it was a very different process than any other project I've worked on, I think.
That's some valuable advice right there, though, because I don't think it would have occurred. I mean, I'm sure it would have come up at some point, but it wouldn't have occurred to me. I even worked in MEP. It's like, I think I got to write maybe a couple of those Division 40 sections, so the process equipment division, in the time that I worked there. But I don't know that I would have even thought about having to take that step if somebody, didn't tell me that you're going to have this insurance thing to deal with that you wouldn't deal with on any normal project. So that's valuable advice for anybody out there working on something that has this kind of unique conditions.
Yeah, I think it speaks to the clients again, that if you go back to what we were talking about in the beginning about these two fellows who hadn't done this before, but they had the dream and they did it. And I think that's part of why they were willing to, use an architect like ourselves that hadn't done this before, because it was sort of similar to the way they start, like just knowing that if you're smart people and you're passionate about what you do, you're probably going to, come at it with some fresh eyes, which is going to be a good thing. But also, you can learn a lot of the nuts and bolts on the job.
Well, I love that as well because they started not knowing anything about distilling whiskey, and they're willing to give an architect, because we all know in this business, sometimes if you want to branch out into another project type, it's really hard getting that first job.
Right.
Because, it's a hospital. You've never done a hospital before. We don't even want to mess with that. And so I applaud them for being open-minded, in that respect, and understanding that,
right.
Because they walked that road.
Yeah.
And now distilleries are popping up all over the Pacific Northwest. So now anybody listening, you know who to call. You need a facility, because now they've got at least a lot of it all figured out. So I understand there were some salvage materials reused on this project. You briefly mentioned it earlier. Tell me about some of the unique materials that you used in these facilities.
Well, one pretty notable one is when I was talking about how we took the end walls, and designed them independent of the skin, and we chose to use a wood product called Kebony. I don't know if you've had any podcasts on that, but it's the kind of this new decking material where they take either softwoods or hardwoods and they bake them at a very high temperature, and it just changes the molecular structure of the wood so that the wood becomes really durable. And so we use that as actually the siding on these end walls. And it was kind of fun because the company that makes it came out and did a fairly long video about the whole facility, the process, Woodinville whiskey, our use of this material, because, just it was kind of a signature utilization of their product. So that's been kind of fun. And it really, if you look at the pictures, you said you might go back and look at them. It's, it really warms the buildings up. And we, as I said, we put the big numbers there and we put big barn doors. So it gives it this sort of agrarian feel, I think, that you might not get if we hadn't put that little bit of wood on the building. And Andy, do you want to mention the reuse of the pieces?
Yeah, just simultaneously with this processing facility in Quincy, we were helping Woodinville Whiskey redo their distillery space. As Brett mentioned at the beginning, they were expanding, and part of that was taking out some of the originally designed spaces, including a mezzanine that was kind of a more of a gathering space that they could be rented out in the old distillery. And so there was a cool metal stair that we had designed 10 years ago to get up there, and a bunch of metal railing for that mezzanine. And all of that came over to the new facility, and was the stair to get up to the mezzanine in this facility and the railing. And the really cool thing about the stair, as Brett kind of alluded to, is I think on their 10th anniversary, they had all the original investors and kind of their friends and the people that had helped them get the business off the ground came, and they signed one of the steel stringers of the stair. And so that's now moved into the process building and is part of that building. So kind of a cool part of the original distillery that made the trip across the mountains with all the whiskey.
That is really cool. Okay, so, and I'm surprised this hasn't come up yet. I know that you have photovoltaic rooftop panels. I don't know what it is about that word. I struggle with that. I used to write specs for it. I cannot say that word. Were there any other sustainability efforts on this project? Did there need to be?
It wasn't a primary focus of the project. We were able to get skylights into the processing building throughout the spaces. So there is a lot of natural light in what is a fairly wide building with relatively minimal windows. But that was, a lot of the industrial process of making whiskey was challenged to incorporate real deep sustainability efforts into at the same time.
Let's talk a little bit about construction. I always joke around that that's where the rubber meets the road with, whether your designs can actually be built the way you design them. And there's no construction process that's perfect. There's always something that comes up. Tell me about one or two challenges that arose during construction and how you dealt with them.
So that transition from the roof to the wall detail that Brett was talking about earlier, that was so important. It was a challenge. We ended up working really closely with the contractor and their roofing subcontractor to do, and the roofing manufacturer, Morin Roofing, and to get mock-ups and work with their technical team on how to do that detail where the standing seam just comes down the roof and then folds around the corner. And probably the biggest challenge in the field for the contractor was the seamer that they need to do those standing seams is a heavy piece of equipment, and it runs well at a pitch down the roof because it's has the slope, but when you get to the edge and it's coming down the vertical face, it gets a lot more challenging for them to control that. And so they really had to dial in their systems on how to do it and keep everything really nice and crisp. And so that's why you don't see a standing seam metal on the side of a lot of buildings. Yeah, the one other interesting piece for us to learn about was how you do a air barrier on a building that doesn't have sheathing. And the prefab manufactured buildings, they have these big steel girts or vents, and then they have steel girts that span between those, but there's no plywood sheathing. The standing seam metal goes right onto the outside of that. And so we worked with this company called that makes a Super Saver system, which is a kind of insulation and air barrier and vapor barrier system that's all integrated and made specifically for pre-manufactured metal buildings. So learned a lot about that, and when the contractor did the blower door test at the end of the project, was surprised how tight of a envelope they were able to get with this system in the end. So
I have a feeling I'll have some people in my office that'll be interested in this episode. There's a couple of things I've heard already that I'm going to send over to the engineers. Was there any challenges getting the skilled labor for construction to where this facility is? Or is it close enough to a bigger populated area that it was no big deal?
Our contractor is based in the Wenatchee area, and they have done several of these pre-manufactured buildings before. I think they had to find the right subs. Like I said, the roofing sub was such an important team member because of the details and just the sheer quantity of standing seam metal roof and siding that happened at these buildings. But I think they did a really great job, and I mean they're still out there on site 6 years after we started this because they keep building these buildings. So I know the clients have been really happy with that relationship, and they've been good contractor partners.
That's going to be pretty striking to have when they build the next 6 that they're planning to have all those. I mean, it's already striking. It really, I love the way you put the numbers on the ends of the building, those huge letters, and added that extra personality to the pre-manufactured buildings. And it pops when you open up that picture, and to have 12 of them out there.
Yes,
I'm interested.
It's really dramatic in the landscape. These buildings that are very big and can be seen from a distance, and then everything around it is just fields of agriculture. So, when you see it, it's pretty powerful.
But it's not dramatic in a sticking out like a sore thumb way at all. The drama fits into the landscape very well, and that's a big deal too. I think that's really important. It's dramatic because of the backdrop, and not because it says, "Why is this square peg in the round hole?" I didn't feel that at all when I looked at it.
Yeah, which is one reason why you asked about the tasting room, because we're really hoping that does come to be, because it'll be really cool for the public to be able to go there and just, look out onto the grain and this fiend ground and sample a little whiskey.
I'll be there soon as I get it done. Every project includes lessons learned. It's one of my favorite questions when I ask it. Whether it's something new you have to tackle or unexpected design challenges or challenges during construction. For each of you, what would you say your biggest lesson learned was from this project that you'll take forward into the next one that you do?
Well, for me, it's the detail that was, as I said, the quintessential detail of the whole project was that roof edge, which I think is quite beautiful. But it resulted in when you don't have a gutter, right, and you have things like doors and openings that you need to protect, you have to do something in addition to that. And so we did have probably a little more water coming down the face of the building near the openings, near the doors and windows and things, that we had to go back and retrofit some awnings, some little overhangs to divert water around them. So whenever you're kind of doing something unique and breaking the rules a little bit, you're going to learn something.
Absolutely. How about you, Andy?
There's actually a kind of recent thing we just learned about, and I think it back to like really understanding the process that's going on inside of the building and what it's being used for. And one of those things is that when they're doing loading, often the garage doors and the loading dock will be open for half the day. And one of the big mechanical units is actually relatively close to one of the loading dock bays, and they've been having some recent problems where that's shorting out because you get just the machine having to work so hard, and then also the difference in the air that's coming out of these garage doors very close to the units. So yeah, I think it's just getting your head into really what the process is and how the building is going to be used in ways that aren't strictly about the architecture, and how to think about some of those things ahead of time to hopefully head off some of those issues.
That's great advice, because I think that is a piece that a lot of times, I've seen it happen a lot of times, it gets a little missed. You talk about the program, and this is what we're doing in this space, but the actual let's walk through what a day looks like. Where you might get somebody to tell you, well, this door is going to be open half the day. And that does affect design, but that's not necessarily something you would think about if you didn't actually walk through a day or walk through specific seasons. One of the winery interviews I did recently, there are certain times of the year when they're picking the grapes that are intense and people are working 18-hour days, and there's it's a critically important phase, but there's a whole different level of activity and different kinds of activity going on during that particular phase. And they discovered some lessons learned due to that wasn't necessarily something that got talked about in great detail as they were designing it. So great advice, people. Walk through a day or specific seasons of a business, depending on what it is or how that building's being used, and it might inform some changes.
Right.
So what is next for Graham Baba? Because, I'll be calling you and saying, okay, what are you going to come talk to me about now at some point? What do you have on the boards, so to speak? Nothing's on boards anymore. What are you working on that we can look forward to seeing from your office in the future?
We're working on an airport out in Virginia. I thought I'd mentioned that we're, on the subject of the metal buildings. We're about a brewery over at Pullman that's going to use one of these pre-manufactured buildings. There's a building up in Chelan, Washington for the Parks Department up there that we designed that's just being completed, which was also a pre-manufactured building. And that was a good example of where we took the standard shapes, and kind of mess with them a little bit to change proportions and change shapes a little bit, and again, still staying within their parameters of their system, but getting a little bit more interesting architecture out of it. We've been doing similar things with some lumber companies around the Northwest that we either retrofitting those kind of buildings or having new ones. And in those cases, we've been using color and paint and super graphics, graphic words and things on the buildings to get some character out of them that way. So I think, we're going to continue to sort of investigate how to take these buildings and make them more interesting.
Well, you are the first interview that I've had doing anything like this. So everybody, you know who to call. This is people, they've already figured it out.
Andy's pretty neat project over here.
Continuing on with the project types that I've never worked on before. I'm working on a golf course clubhouse with a double-decker driving range pavilion attached to it in Yakima, Washington, that will open hopefully this fall. So it's a fun project.
Well, you don't get bored when you're taking on new project types, right?
Nope.
Don't get bored. Which is a beautiful lead-in to my two closing questions. I always end with a broad industry question in my final question. So for the broader industry question, I'm curious. So some firms specialize in one project type, and some firms do every project type under the sun. And I've worked in both environments. My first architectural firm I worked in for 22 years did schools. They did nothing else. They were fantastic at schools. But I think maybe twice in that 22 years did we do something that wasn't a school. As our buildings, and I can see pros and cons either way, as our buildings get more complicated, in your opinion, do you think firms will start trending towards being more specialized in one project type, or do you think the technology that's available to us today will make it easier for firms to do a bunch of different project types and be successful?
Well, is it possible that it could be both?
It probably will be both.
I think that there's some complex building types that, you kind of need a specialist for, and then will especially as they get more complicated, people will be needed to work on those things. But I think that the whole thing about the technology and what we can do now, and digital fabrication is changing everything, and you can do everything digitally now. You can measure a building digitally, you can model it digitally, and you can then build it. And I think that will allow. I mean, we're a good example of a firm that does. We talked about this earlier. We do all kinds of stuff, and can be successful as things we haven't done before. Partly because of just the advances in technology. So I kind of feel like it might be both. I don't know, Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess just speaking, like, I hope we don't get too specialized, because I think that's part of what I love about our firm and our work and the profession in general, is that we get to do a lot of diverse things, and we get to, we're not just cranking out the same thing over and over again. And that's the interesting part of design, and it's the new problems to solve. And but yeah, certainly helps to have the right tools when you're diving into some of these new project types that you don't understand as well, or to start to learn about it.
I do a lot of teaching in the industry, and I always tell everybody, if you think you're an expert in this industry, you need to get out of the business, because this is a lifelong learner industry, and you can get really, really good at some things, and then somebody is going to take a 2x4 and hit you upside the head and change everything. And with our technology advances, that's in my career. I went from a Tandy Radio Shack, was the only computer in my first office. Through all of these phases, you also have to be very adaptable and willing to learn new things. And though we've always done it this way model does not work. I don't know that it ever really worked, but it really doesn't work now because things are changing every 5 minutes. I love it personally.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I hope firms will stay more diverse and not get into that. It just felt to me like I'm seeing more and more firms get super specialized.
Well,
because there's the cost factor of learning as well.
I mentioned to you that we're working on an airport. We've never done an airport before, and we're working with another firm on this who knows a lot more than we do. But I have been amazed at how much I could learn on the internet about, aviation design. I mean, there's all kinds of standards, and there's industry, groups that publish data and things that it's just so accessible. It's really amazing.
Have you gotten into AI yet?
We have not so much, but we're seeing it, and it's really interesting. So
I certainly have a few clients who have expressed interest in it, and are people bringing us things that they generated or worked with AI to generate to show us images and stuff. So it is definitely changing the industry, or starting to at least.
Some of that research, you got to still do your homework. The AI can come back with some pretty crazy stuff, but people are using it all kinds of, preparing a presentation that they have to do and getting, the guts of all that research down and then parsing it into their presentation. And it's getting used more and more in design, and it's imperfect. But they say that it is a little scary, but that it learns and grows from everybody who uses it, and it'll get better and better over time. So I'm hearing that a lot more in design firms. So I was just curious whether anybody jumped into that pool, even just to play with it, like researching airport design.
Yeah.
Interesting. So final question. Everybody gets this question. It's been modified a little bit since the last time you were on. So I hope we all hope to live a life that makes some kind of contribution to make the better world, or make the world a better place in some way. So the final question for you is personal or professional. There's no right answer here. And it doesn't mean it's the only answer. What do you hope your impact will be?
I think I'm very interested in helping our firm incorporate sustainability practices more into our day-to-day practice, but doing that in a way that doesn't get away from our strong basis in design first, and that being the most important thing. And so how can we kind of do quiet sustainability into our design, but knowing that we need to be pushing forward to that, because as an industry, that's important for us to do our part to kind of helping to rein in climate change and leave a better world for the next generation than we currently are doing.
Well, I agree. And in all honesty, I think it will eventually become standard practice. It won't be a thing anymore. It'll be just a part of the way buildings have to be designed if we want this world to last, for our kids and grandkids and the people coming behind us, and be a valuable place to live. How about you, Brett? How are you going to make a difference? How would you like to?
I just hope that my legacy is just leaving behind, some beauty, some architecture that's inspiring and uplifting. And that's really what I hope my legacy is. I'm also, in my last year's practice, wanting to, impart some wisdom to our office full of younger people, and help them carry on what we've been doing and do even better work.
Those ripples of that mentorship go so far beyond anything you'll ever know. I think back to, because I'm a strong proponent of mentoring that makes sense, good mentoring, and I think back to my career and some of the things I've been able to achieve as a direct result of a great mentor I had that took the time to teach me something, or let me do something out of the box, because I always have crazy ideas. Here, let me do this. That, changed the whole course of my career. I had no intention of working in architecture. This was not even on my radar. But I, landed with some people that really would teach me anything I wanted to know. And I don't think a lot of those people will ever have any idea how much they changed the complete course of my life. And you probably never will. So know that you are already doing that.
Good.
You're already making that impact that will go on beyond you, because I mentor a lot of people because of that was given to me, and I feel a need to give that back. And hopefully some of the people I mentor will do the same. Gentlemen, this episode is cram-packed with valuable stuff, and it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days to talk to me today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you'll be back, right?
Absolutely. If you'll have
Correct answer. Correct answer.
You'll have it. We will.
Okay. Thank you again.